So here we have our first unit on understanding race. And today is the first sort of introductory material that goes along with this unit. And as I said, this chapter that was assigned for this week for today is from a book called Racial Formation in the United States. It was originally published in 1986, and it is by authors Omi and Winant. And the chapter that we were reading is chapter number 4. So some background information about this chapter, about this reading and book in general, is that this book is a landmark book in the field of ethnic studies. And Michael Omi and Howard Winant are renowned sociologists, and they're well known as the creators of the theory of racial formation. So what this means is that this book in general put forth this theory of racial formation, which has gone on to inform perspectives within different aspects of ethnic studies since it was published. And today, their theory is widely accepted and expanded upon by numerous other authors. And they have released several editions where they update more and more information and put in more relevant examples and things like that. But their theory has remained relatively the same. And we're going to, of course, unpack what that theory is and what it means. Now, it's interesting, too, that these are authors and scholars who are in sociology. And it basically shows us that ethnic studies is an interdisciplinary field. So interdisciplinary, meaning it is a field of study that spans several different disciplines. It overlaps with many different disciplines. Ethnic studies does not exist in a vacuum. And in fact, no subject does, but certainly not ethnic studies. Ethnic studies draws on work from sociologists, from anthropologists, from historians, from literature scholars, from media scholars, and so on and so forth. So here, starting with sociologists, we can see that ethnic studies draws from sociology in really big ways. Now, one of the most foremost ethnic studies scholars was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was also known as the father of sociology. So there is definitely a deep connection between ethnic studies and other types of disciplines and fields. Interestingly, both Omi and Winant are professors in California at Berkeley and at UC Santa Barbara. And so they are both, sort of living legends in that way. And it's also interesting, too, because it implies, or it sort of demonstrates that a lot of foundational knowledge within ethnic studies was founded here in California. Last week, we spoke about the history of ethnic studies and the first College of Ethnic Studies being born out of the longest student protest in United States history. And that occurred at San Francisco State University. And so again, ethnic studies was truly born in California. So there are several key terms that are incredibly important that we sort of unpack within this reading. And the first is race, and that's going to be the case for every reading that we cover this semester. Every reading is going to define race in different ways. Each one might build off of the other. It's rare that the definitions conflict, but sometimes they're going to differ. Some readings will take a more historical perspective as to what race means. Some will challenge those perspectives and give us more contemporary definitions. But in general, it's a good idea when doing the readings for this class that we figure out how these authors are understanding race. And that goes for any reading. It's important to know how a person or how an author is defining their key concept that they're talking about. Because if we don't understand how they're defining it, then we're not going to understand what they're saying about it or the claims that they're making about it. Now, on the very first page of the reading, and the reading was, I think, about a total of 29 pages, but the last few pages are just endnotes and footnotes, which is also something that you should consider when thinking about these readings. And so it's really about 25 pages, given that the rest are notes. And so on the first page of this reading, there's a sentence that says, race is a way of making up people. That's the first sentence of the first page of chapter 4. Now, this is a really, I think, interesting way of opening up this chapter. And I think it very much holds true to what we understand about race. Again, race is a way of making up people, right? So you can see right away that they're going to be talking about the impetus, the human impetus, right, or impulse to categorize people, how we go about categorizing people, why we go about categorizing people, as well as the sort of difficulties in categorizing people, given that they're all very arbitrary categories. So they do define race. They say race is a concept that signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. So kind of a vague and interesting definition of race here. And you'll see that race is one of the things that it seems so self-evident. It seems like, well, clearly this person is white and this person is brown. That's race, right? But we are certainly going to make sure that we complicate or we problematize these very easy definitions of race, because it is not that easy. It's much more complex than just skin color. It's more complex than just culture, right? It is a lot of different things. And right away, we see that Omi and Winant are understanding race as a concept that makes up a lot of social conflict and serves different political interests. And it's a concept that allows people to reference different types of people based on what they see. So this person looks different than this person, so we're going to categorize them. And then from there, we're going to create this society that for some reason places so much importance and significance on these very subjective and arbitrary categorizations, right? So they say race is, quote, an unstable and decentered complex of social meanings constantly being transformed by political struggle. So again, right away, we see that politics is also an important piece here to race, this idea of political struggle. They also say that the definitions, meanings, and overall coherence of prevailing social categories are always subject to multiple interpretations. No social category rises to the level of being understood as a fixed, objective social fact. So what does this mean? Basically, what they're saying here is that race, along with other types of social categories and identities, and that could be gender, it could be sex, it could be sexuality, it could be ethnicity, all of these different types of social categories are never completely objective, and they are not always going to be the same. Our view of these different social categories has changed and evolved tremendously over time. We don't understand gender, right, or race in the same way today that we did in the 18th century or the 19th century or even 20 years ago. So these understandings and interpretations change and evolve over time, which in and of itself is a pretty big and important claim, right? So if our understandings and interpretations of these social categories changes over time, then so does the significance of race, right? It becomes more and less important depending on the context, depending on the time period. Race is also not something that is biological or something that is just rooted in nature. So back when there was this impulse to categorize human beings into different categories, there was this classification of the 5 different human races, right? And it was an incredibly racist and unscientific categorization of humans. It has since been thoroughly debunked, and we know now that race is not biological. There is nothing in our DNA that is different from each other. We are not different types of species. We're not different types of humans. We're all one human race. We have very little in our differences in regard to our actual DNA. What is different is our phenotype, right? So phenotype is an important word here. And what it means is those are the physical characteristics that we can see. Those are like characteristics such as our eye colors, our hair color, our hair texture and type, our skin color, our height, our body types. Those are all the physical things we can see. And that is what we have now sort of understood race to be, as things that are different about us, that are visible to the eye. But in the 20th century, right, 18th and 20th, I mean, the 19th and 20th centuries, there was scientific racism, which helped to classify human beings into literal different types of species. And pointing to actual genetic DNA, which is a theme from the video that I want us to watch on Wednesday, that has been a way to oppress and subjugate people for generations. Because if you can somehow say that this person is not actually a human being, they belong to a different species or race, then it's easier to justify their oppression, right? Instead of realizing, if you said that we were all the same, right, when it comes down to scientific DNA, then there is little justification to give in regard to why certain people should be oppressed versus others. So the idea of categorizing, right, and this idea that we place, or the significance that we place on the differences between us, has served to oppress and subjugate different people, right, groups of people, and in particular Black and Native American people, for generations, right, literal hundreds and hundreds of years. And while that might not be the case outrightly today, that legacy certainly continues to influence our understanding of race, our understanding of others, how we treat others, as well as influences our laws, policies, politics, and so on. So next, we have race as a master category. So they say, Omi and Winant say, that race has become a template of both difference and inequality. So what they say here is that the establishment and reproduction of different systems of domination, inequality, and difference in the United States they've consciously drawn upon concepts of difference, hierarchy, and marginalization based on race. And this is basically another way of saying that in order to put a hierarchy in place where some people are on the top, some people are on the bottom, these systems have always drawn on the idea of difference. So difference has always been a way to subjugate others, right? And that's why when we talk about diversity and celebrating difference, right, in the year of 2022, it is incredibly different than what we have previously understood difference being. And typically we understand somebody different as bad, right, because it's different than you. And unfortunately, we've always assumed that if somebody's different than ourselves, they have to then be worse in some way, shape, or form. They have to be lower on the social hierarchy. And that is indeed the case in this country as well, right? So difference has been used as a template. So anytime somebody is different, it usually equates to instilling a practice of inequality that further perpetuates this hierarchy, this social hierarchy. So race has become a template for structuring society in a way that politically, economically, and culturally marginalizes some while privileging others. Race is essentially a template for understanding who is the supervisor and who is the subordinate, who is the rich person versus who is the poor, who is highly educated versus who is not, right? This concept of race has sort of infiltrated our every understanding of other people, of class, of gender, of everything. It is just, race is the master category, right? This is their whole point here. They say race is a fundamental organizing principle of social stratification. It has influenced the definition of rights and privileges, the distribution of resources, and the ideologies and practices of subordination and oppression. The concept of race as a marker of difference has permeated all forms of social relations. It is a template for the processes of marginalization that continue to shape social structures, as well as collective and individual psyches. So it's not only something that is prevalent within our political systems and social systems, but race is also something that's pervasive in our own minds as well, right? In our own psychologies. And so we tend to ourselves have implicit bias in regard to who we see as a threat and who we don't, who we see as right, the CEO of a company as far, and who isn't, who is a rough crowd, right, versus who is a good crowd, who is a bad person versus who is a good person, who is a criminal versus who isn't, right? Now, we'd like to think that we are completely unbiased in this regard, but studies have shown time and time again that implicit bias is incredibly prevalent across the board, no matter who you are, right? Now, I'm not saying that everybody is racist. That's not necessarily true. But what I am saying is that implicit bias is an important and real social phenomenon. And therefore, race is not only a way of categorizing people politically, economically, but also individually, right, in our own minds. So race is so pervasive that it even influences what we think about others, and then how we treat others, right? So they also say, the authors also say that race is a metonym of culture. Now, you might have heard the word metonym back in the day, but it basically means when one thing stands in for the other, right? So like the main example here would be Washington. Washington usually stands in for the president or the president's administration. So you might hear in the news, like, a word from Washington is that this new law is going to go into effect next year. And so Washington is not an actual person. The Washington, D.C., the city didn't say anything about the laws. That word just stands in for the larger, right, understanding of the president and the president's cabinet and administration. And so that's what a metonym is. So what the authors here say is that race is also a metonym for culture inequality and stratification. And so in this way, then, a person's race is essentially used to stand in for other things about them, such as their character, their social status, their economic status, and even their sexuality in a lot of cases. So race is a master category. It helps categorize so many things in our society, both in a systemic level, right, structurally, as well as on an individual level. Now, racialization. So what Omi and Winant define racialization is as, quote, the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified relationship, social practice, or group. So racialization occurs in large scale and small scale ways, so macro and micro, right? Now, one example of this is racial profiling, for example. How can one tell a person's capability for committing a crime just by the color of their skin or their hair type or their nose shape, right? That is a fundamental process of racialization. There is no race, right? There's no like raced aspect to hair, but we give it that meaning as a society, right? We have terms for particular types of hair that are associated with different racial groups. It doesn't mean that hair itself is like a thing that is fundamentally raced. It's something that we as a society give it that meaning, right? We wouldn't understand that as having, we wouldn't understand noses as having a race, but we associate racialized meanings, right, with those particular aspects. Or another example would be that names, right? There's no, like, names are not associated to a particular race, right? Yet certain names are considered white and certain names are considered Black, certain names are considered Asian, right? We give it that meaning. We have those associations. And in that same manner, it's really interesting when those names become so racialized, right, that it influences the types of jobs that we can get. There's a famous example, a famous video, I can show it to you all, where it's Joe versus Jose. And this same person sends in, like, I want to say like 20 different applications, job applications with his resume. And half of them, say Jose, and half of them say like Joe or something. And he gets callbacks on almost every single one of them when it is Joe versus, when it's his actual name, Jose. And it's just really interesting because it goes to show that implicit bias is incredibly real and has real consequences. And again, that is a literal manifestation of this process of racialization. When we give racial meaning to something that was not previously racialized, right? So sort of to summarize, race is a concept, but it's also representation of identity. And it often refers to different types of human bodies. It refers to the phenotypic markers, which, as we said, right, have to do with the things that we can see. So it refers to different markers of difference. And importantly, it also refers to the types of social practices that are put in place because of these perceived differences. Ultimately, race is not self-evident. You can't just perceive someone's race just by looking at them. I'm one of those people. I get it all the time. What are you? Right? You look kind of like this, but maybe also kind of like this. You can't just tell somebody's race, right? Instead, racialization is needed to perceive someone's race because race depends on the meanings and associations that stick to certain types of human bodies. Once those meanings have stuck to them, that's when we say, oh yeah, that's a Black thing, or that's a white thing, or that's, an Asian thing. It's only after this process of racialization that we come to those understandings. And it seems so common sense, what is race and what isn't. But essentially, it really isn't. It's something that occurs over time as a society. So moving on, racial formation. This is key terms part 2. Now, these are the last of the key terms that I have drawn out for us. And if you do read the reading or follow along with the reading, you will see that each section of this chapter is organized by these different key terms. So there is about a page and a half per term that explains it more fully. Again, I'm just here breaking it down for laying out sort of the main points of each of these different terms. Now, racial formation is clearly an important concept. That's the title of the book. That's the title of Omi and Winant's theory. So they are famous for having said, quote, racial formation refers to the socio-historical process by which racial identities are created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed. Now, what the heck does this mean? Well, Omi and Winant believe that race plays an enormous role in both the historical and contemporary moments of the United States. And Omi and Winant see the role of race as embedded within all US institutions. And they see it as a powerful force that drives categorization, separation among people, as well as political structure and political struggles. So structure and culture are important to racial formation processes, both separately and in relation to one another. Right? So for them, racial projects is what helps racial formation takes place. Okay, so in racial projects, this is where efforts are made to shape and distribute some form of resource or capital along racial lines. So you might think about this in terms of like which neighborhoods have the most funding to therefore have the best schools, right? Or which neighborhoods are typically the ones that have the most landfills and environmental pollution versus which ones aren't, right? There are literal lines that are drawn among people where who has resources and who doesn't, right? Who has to live with the pollution of living underneath the freeway versus who are folks who are able to live in areas that don't have the same amount of environmental pollution, right? Or which areas have the most voting power, right, versus who doesn't. There are many ways to understand this aspect of resource distribution, but the authors here, Omi and Winant, want you to know that race informs all of these practices, right? Again, race is a master category. And so the idea of racial formation is how are things formed? How are our structure, how are different societal, political, economic, and cultural structures formed with this concept of race? And so according to Omi and Winant, racial projects here are the building blocks of the racial formation process. They are the building blocks that allow us to see how racial categorizations are hierarchically, right, meaning a hierarchy of somebody on the top and somebody on the bottom. So they're the building blocks that allow us to see how racial categorizations are hierarchically organized over time to benefit one group over the other. And by focusing on racial projects, we can understand the ways that race, including its cultural meanings and structural outcomes, how it's both constructed and contested, meaning how it's both constructed and challenged, how it takes place in social context and how it differs. Racial formation is just the larger theory that each of these terms help to explain, right? Each of the terms that we're going over today help explain what racial formation is. Racial formation processes occur by linking the structure with the meaning that we've come to assign it with. Again, when the beginning of time, right, there was no such thing as race. We as a society have collectively created that meaning, and we have then linked those racialized meanings to different names, to different people, to different bodies, to different body parts, and then we treat it as if it's always been that way, when it hasn't. It's changed over time, and yet we give it so much significance, and that's how our society is structured, right? And so that linking process is what Omi and Winant call racial projects, right? So racial projects are, they say they're simultaneously, meaning at the same time, an interpretation, a representation, or explanation of racial identities and meanings, and an effort to organize and distribute resources along particular racial lines. So racial projects do both the ideological and practical work of making all these links stick to each other, right? So racial projects connect what race means in a particular context and the ways in which racial structures or social structures and everyday experiences are racially organized. So what this means is, in a more practical sense, is that the idea of racial profiling, right? That is a type of racialization, as we said before, but it's also a racial project, right? To go ahead and start linking who and who isn't a criminal, or who is quote unquote illegal versus who is a citizen, right? That's a racial project. That is something that we come to, for whatever reason, implement in our society. And it 100% organizes and distributes resources along particular racial lines. That is why some people have to hide in fear. That's why some people have to fear the police while others don't, right? These are all racial projects. This language is just giving you, these terms are giving you the language to describe the things that you already know, the things that we already see in society or have already experienced firsthand. This is just language that helps you to explain how these things come to be, right? So racial projects, they occur on a large scale and small scale. Racial projects are not only at the macro level of, like, for example, policy making, like I said, or state activity, but also at the level of everyday experience and personal interactions. So racial projects can also just reflect how society feels about particular types of people. And then from there, there are larger systems and policies and laws that are structured around those understandings and interpretations and feelings. So laws and policies are always going to be influenced and shaped by contemporary societal understandings of race. And racial projects basically shape policy. They exercise political influence, and they also organize our own understandings of race as everyday common sense. So to see racial projects operating at the level of everyday life, we really have to examine the ways in which we notice race, often unconsciously, as I said before, in this like implicit bias. We use race to understand or to give clues about who a person is. We expect people to act their apparent racial identity, right? Like when we see a person who is a particular race, we're like, oh, well, they're not acting Black or they're not acting white. We expect them to act out the identity that we see. And if they act differently, right, then we're like, what? That's not Black, that's not white, right? That's not brown. Like, think of all the stereotypes about particular racial groups, as well as stereotypes about those who don't act out their race in the proper manner. So that's why you hear things like Oreo or banana or something like that when it's describing a concept of a person, quote unquote, not acting their race, as if a race has a particular way of acting. Again, these are all things that we as a society have collectively attached meanings to over time as racial projects. So again, these processes of racialization help us to explain racial projects. Racial projects help us explain the overall theory of racial formation. All of these terms are building up to help explain the others, right? Okay, so what about racism? We now understand the different processes of social categorization. We understand how race is a metonym, or how it stands in, right, for other aspects of one's identity and character. We understand how racial projects are the things that we see in everyday life, both on the macro level with policies and at the micro level with how we understand and treat others. But what about racism? No, what they say is a racial project can be described or defined as racist if it creates or reproduces structures of domination based on racial significations and identities. Now, what does this mean? Basically, racism is complex, and racist projects exist in a web, like a spider web, that operates at varying scales, okay? So there's the core, and then it goes up and up and up and up and up. Now, importantly, racism is not the same as race. This is really, really important. So oftentimes people say, like, well, if you stop talking about race, right, then maybe it'll go away. Well, not usually, right? That's not usually how things work. When you just ignore them, it doesn't just disappear, right? Or other times people might say, well, you're the one bringing up race. You're the racist. Why are you bringing it up? Again, it's because people understand race as being something taboo or being something bad in and of itself. Racism is bad in and of itself. Race itself is not. But we tend to think that they're the same thing, and they are not. Racism also doesn't just stop anti-racism. Racism can be combated with anti-racist projects, right? But oftentimes we don't talk about those things because people don't like bringing up race because they think it's the same as racism. And again, it is not, right? Now, racism and racial projects, none of these things are what we call monolithic. What that means is that none of these things are indestructible. We can always destroy racist projects. We can always destroy particular aspects of racism. But we tend to think that it's something that has always been there and it's just the way things are. And therefore we accept them, but we do not have to. And oftentimes, if the only reason why you're doing something is because it's just the way things are, it's a good time to question that practice, right? Or challenge it. Now, at one time, it was obvious that racist projects included the most terrible and most noticeable form of outright racism, right? So a racial project that would be racist would be like lynching or segregation or genocide. Those are all racist racial projects. That's when we can say that is outright racism. And people tend to understand racism in this way. Well, there's no Jim Crow segregation, so therefore racism doesn't exist, right? But nowadays, racism has become much more subtle. You might not get this like in-your-face racism. Doesn't mean that it's not racist, right? People often think that because there's less explicit in-your-face violent racism, that it just doesn't exist. Or sometimes they think that because some African American, Asian, or Latinos have achieved a particular social status, that there is no racism. They'll be like, well, look at Oprah Winfrey. She's rich, therefore there is no racism, right? Like, you probably heard all of these things in the past. I know I have. Some people even think that if it's not in a person's intention to be racist, that they're not actually being racist. But of course, it's not that simple. A person can't simply just deny their intention to be racist and then it's not racist, right? So it doesn't matter what your intention is. It doesn't matter how big or small it is. It doesn't matter whether it's in your face versus it's subtle. It can still be a racist racial project, right? If it creates or reproduces structures of domination, and oftentimes even the smallest microaggressions work together collectively to uphold structures of domination, right? Where somebody's on the top and somebody's on the bottom. And we see certain groups as having these positive characteristics and certain racialized groups as having negative characteristics. So as Omi and Winant say, quote, the absence of individual intent does little or nothing to unwind the social structures through which racism flourishes and is reproduced. So what they say here is that it basically doesn't matter what your intention is, right? We've all had great intentions, but at the end of the day, it's our actions that matter. So in the post-civil rights era, racism has been largely, though not entirely, detached from its perpetrators. And this is where it gets really tough. If you don't see anybody, right? If there's not a person that you can blame on a particular racist project, right? Then who do you blame? How do you understand it? How do you see it? And so when racism is, or when racial projects become racist and become racism, right? According to Omi and Winant, it often seeps into our laws and our policies in a way that we can't attach that to a particular person. That is what we call systemic racism. And now it is hard for a lot of people to see it, right? Because they're not understanding race in this very nuanced, complicated way. They're saying, well, nobody's telling you to be poor. So I don't see how poverty is a racialized issue. You can just go out and work hard. It's the same for everybody. When we know for a fact that it's not, because 350 plus years of enslavement is inevitably going to affect the ability, right, of Black and Native American folks to achieve the same sort of social status as others who have always had that privilege, right? Inevitably, that is going to affect their social status, their economic status, their struggle for self-determination. So we have to understand race and racial projects as things that have occurred throughout history and have evolved, right? And so when we don't understand that racism is systemic, we have a hard time seeing it. It's detached from an actual person, right? And in its most advanced forms, racism, it has no perpetrators. In its most advanced forms, racism is nearly invisible. It's just taken for granted. In fact, in its most advanced forms, racism is just common sense. It just informs our everyday life and our social structures. In fact, we don't even question it. That is how pervasive racism truly is. And this is the exact situation that has allowed US courts and mainstream political discourse to block race-conscious measures, such as affirmative action or reparations, right? This is exactly why we can say that the US is a colorblind society. Or this is exactly why we can say, ugh, anti-racist activists like these football players kneeling and these people marching in the streets are so unnecessary, right? Or these professors talking about critical race theory, they are just totally playing the race card. They're the ones being the real racist. That is how pervasive racism truly is. When people trying to fight racism are understood as the racists, that's when we have a very important and significant problem that we need to identify and that we need to debunk, right? That we need to unpack. And these are all things that occur when you don't have a good understanding of what race is. This is what happens when you think that racism is only racism if it is something that's being shouted from a particular person, if it's an actual lynching or a policy of segregation. If that's the only way that you understand racism, then certainly you're not going to understand how race is a master category. And this is why we have to have these fundamental understandings of these particular key terms before we can continue on and understand more contemporary issues, right? Now, we have a couple more slides, but I'm going to stop here and see if maybe we have any questions, and then we might be able to continue as well. Okay, so we have our key claims here. Now we went through all of the key terms, and in going through that process, I think we did lay out a lot of the key claims, but here's a summary of them. So first is that race is a way of making up people. Therefore, we know that race is a way of othering people. It's a way of saying you are different than me, this person is different than them. Therefore, we have all of these different categories. The second piece here is that social categories vary in meaning and significance over time, right? What we once understood as being a woman is very different than we understand now, right? At one time, being a woman meant that you had literally no rights, right? Now, today in 2022, that is not the case, yet there are still ways in which women are not necessarily equal in terms of equal pay and other aspects of our social life. But regardless, what I'm trying to say here is that the meaning and significance of particular social categories changes over time. So no social category is fixed or objective. There isn't one thing in regard to our identities or our social category that is the same as it was in 1650 than as it is now in 2022, right? It varies, it changes. Therefore, we cannot just assume that what is our process now in the United States, we can't assume it's just always been that way. It hasn't, right? The study of race is fundamentally intersectional. Now, we're going to have a whole unit on intersectionality, but it is important to sort of lay it out now, at least in a preliminary sense. So this means that race as a master category, right, if you remember that, race affects and influences all other aspects of one's identity, whether that is your gender, your sex, your sexuality, right, your ethnicity, your language, your heritage, your culture. Race intersects with all those other identities. It overlaps with all those other identities. It influences, in some ways, related to all of those other identities. And so the study of race is the study of identity, is the study of social identity, cultural identity, racial identity, ethnic identity, etc., national identity, religious identity even. The study of race is more than just a study of skin color. Fundamentally, it is intersectional. It overlaps. It influences all other aspects of your identity as a human being. Now, another key claim that Omi and Winant give us here is that race is both a template for oppression, but it's also a template of resistance. Now, what does this mean? It means that, yes, race as a master category can lead to oppressive systems, right? But it can also lead to resistance. Once people who have been othered or oppressed or categorized in negative ways, right? Once they understand there are similarities among each other, there is a very large scale possibility, right? There's a very large possibility for large scale resistance. And we've seen that happen, right, in the last couple of years, in the larger movement for racial justice, in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and in other social movements. So race is not always going to equal racism. Racism as a master category isn't always going to equal oppression. Racial projects aren't always going to be racist. They could also be the opposite, right? They could also be resistant. They could also be liberation. They can also be anti-racist. Now, also, race cannot be just dismissed simply because it's not biologically real, right? Yes, our DNA might be the same. There might not be a particular molecule that makes you Black, or a molecule, right, or a genome that makes you brown. That's not the case, right? That's been thoroughly debunked. Scientists do not believe racism is race is scientifically or biologically real. Yet it is still very much real in the type of social consequences, right, that we experience. The implication here is that race is real and yet not real, right? Race is not real biologically, but it's certainly real socially, economically, culturally, personally. And so you can't just dismiss it because it's not biologically, scientifically able to categorize us into different species of people or races, right? They're just social categories. And yet those social categories as a master category affect and influence all aspects of our lives. And lastly, the process of racialization depends on the meanings and associations that create phenotypic distinctions among human bodies. What that means is that the way that we look, our nose shape, our hair texture, our eyebrows, our eye color, our eye shape, all of those phenotypic distinctions, that is how the meanings, the racialized meanings that we place on those things, that's how we continue to distinguish each other. That's how we differentiate each other. And this process of racialization depends on the link between race and a particular physical manifestation. So race is not necessarily, eyes can't be races, right? Names can't have races. But when we start to link or stick certain aspects of race to eyes, to hair, to hands, to height, to language, once we start doing that, that's the process of racialization. And it happens all the time, every day, in the macro level and on the micro level. And we do it and perpetuate it all the time. But we don't tend to think about it because that is how pervasive and taken for granted race and racism really are. So race has evolved over time, right? Historically, though, people have always tried to categorize people based on perceived differences. And your reading goes into how this is even the case in biblical stories, right? There's always been this attempt to categorize people, and it's always been an unscientific and messy and inaccurate attempt, right? And, there wasn't really even until the Europeans reached the Western Hemisphere that an actual discourse of race began to appear. And that, of course, led to a racialized social structure. These perceived differences eventually led to oppression, enslavement, and genocide. Now, importantly, though, it didn't have to. Racism is not inevitable. So when we understand history as a progress narrative, a linear progress narrative, then it seems that racism and oppression and genocide and enslavement were just inevitable on our way to progress. But we have to challenge that understanding of history. History doesn't just evolve in a straight line where back in the day we were bad and now we're getting better and better, right? That's a very oversimplified view of history that we've been taught from a very young age. But in our study in ethnic studies, we understand that history moves in all types of ways. It circles back, it goes backward and forward, right? It repeats itself even. And so we need to understand that enslavement, oppression, genocide, these were not inevitable things that, oh, well, duh, that was always going to happen before we got to our progressive views on race. It never had to happen, right? But that is the power of categorization. That is the power of racial projects. That is the power of racism. And these larger sort of social structures, both good and bad, ended up sort of allowing society to question themselves throughout time. It's led to larger ethical questions about what is a human being and what is the nature of human difference? And what does difference even mean? Is there even a difference, right? Our need to use common sense to just say, look, that person's black, this person's white, this person's brown. Clearly there's a difference. We so want to believe in these differences. And yet, what does it mean if we didn't understand difference? What does it mean if we understood difference differently? What does it mean if we moved from difference to equality? Or why does difference have to mean inequality, right? Why can't it mean equality? Why does everybody have to be the same or look the same in order to be treated equally? These are all larger ethical questions that we're all going to ask ourselves as time goes on, as our thinking about race and racism evolve, even as preliminary scholars of ethnic studies in this class. So I challenge you throughout each reading to lay out the key claims that the authors are making, to lay out the key terms, to highlight the definitions of these key terms, even if it's confusing, and to ask yourselves these larger questions to continuously challenge our understandings of these concepts that seem so common sense, but are really anything but.